Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Aaron Stein, Chief Content Officer at War on the Rocks, and what follows is Ben Powell, Adam Goldman, Noman Merchant, Dustin Voles, and Josh Gerstein talking about the media, secrecy, and the role of transparency in holding administrations accountable. Enjoy the conversation.
Our panel is on the media, secrecy, and transparency, and I can't think of a better group to discuss these topics with. I'm going to go ahead and do an introduction of each of the panelists, and then we're going to do this in a Q&A format and also leave some time for your questions at the end. First, on my immediate left here is Adam Goldman, who reports on the FBI for the New York Times and was part of the team that won a Pulitzer Prize in 2018 for national reporting on Russia and the presidential election. Previously, he covered national security for the Washington Post and worked on the investigative team at the Associated Press, where he was part of the reporting on the department that won the 2012 Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting. He is the co-author of Enemies Within, Inside the NYPD Secret Spying Unit and Bin Laden's Final Plot Against America. Next to Adam is Josh Gerstein, who's Politico's senior legal affairs reporter. Josh covers the intersection of law and politics, including special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation, as well as the initial inquiry into the Trump-Russia saga. His reporting and legal analysis has been featured in outlets such as National Public Radio, CNN, Fox News, the New York Times, and New Republic. He also reports on the Justice Department and legal controversies. Just before President Obama's inauguration in 2009 is when he joined Politico as a White House reporter, returning to a beat he covered as White House correspondent for ABC News. In 2019, his Politico magazine report on the secret deal between U.S. and Australia dealing with the resettlement of refugees was a finalist for Scoop of the Year in Australia's most prestigious journalism awards, the Walkleys. He is also a prodigious user of the Freedom of Information Act to wrest information out of federal agencies. And we're going to, of course, talk some more about this and get into this with the panelists. Next to Josh is Dustin Voles of the Wall Street Journal. Dustin is a cybersecurity and intelligence reporter for the Wall Street Journal. His coverage focuses on national security and geopolitical dimensions of nation-state hacking conflicts, digital espionage, online influence operations, election interference, and government surveillance. Before joining the Journal in 2018, Dustin worked at Reuters and National Journal. His reporting has been internationally recognized, including by the White House Correspondents Association, the Gerald Loeb Awards, the Society of Publishers in Asia, and the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights. And then holding up the end, the anchor person, Noman Merchant is a journalist for the Associated Press covering intelligence and national security. His article, resulting from a year-long investigation of law enforcement misconduct, won awards from the American Bar Association and Associated Press media editors and was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. He also was a reporter on immigration and the border in Texas and part of the team nominated for the Pulitzer Prize for national reporting. So we're very fortunate to have this panel and for them to take time out of their very busy schedules to come down and discuss this important topic. Adam, let me start with you. A lot of discussion about overclassification, improper classification at this conference, and reasons for that. Just from your perspective, being a longtime reporter in this, I wanted to ask you about what you perceive in terms of, do you see overclassification and improper classification as reasons for why people make unauthorized disclosures to the media, whether they're trying to cover up government misconduct or embarrassment, all of which, of course, would be contrary to the proper use of the classification system?
Well, let me just start by saying that the government does not like me publishing their secrets. I don't know if people know this, but the Obama administration, their Department of Justice subpoenaed my phone records as part of a leak investigation. And then the Trump administration came back around and they subpoenaed my phone records. And they actually tried to get my emails, but a judge didn't allow that. So I've been targeted by both Democratic and Republican administrations. So, and they definitely do not like me publishing their secrets. But for the most part, I think, it's difficult for me to sort of address the misclassification. Are things over classified or misclassified? I do remember when the WikiLeaks happened. When we were looking at all these State Department cables, you'd have some junior diplomat in an embassy in Bulgaria, name your country, go down to the local bodega, read the newspapers, the headlines from the newspapers, put them in a cable back to Washington, and that was marked secret. Literally reading the newspapers, right, that were just at the bodega and marking that secret. From my perspective, and we actually wrote a story about it, from my perspective, that seemed to be a overclassification or misclassification. I have come across secrets and published stories based on them that seem to be appropriately classified. We wrote a big story about how the CIA lost many of their agents in China. It was a big deal. It was a big blow to the CIA, and they got really angry. We wrote about that, but we thought the government needed to know that the agency had blown it in China. And I think one of the reasons, and the government didn't seize my phone, didn't try to get my phone records in that, but I know they did a scorched earth leak investigation trying to find out who had provided us that information. But we thought it was important to tell people that this particular intelligence agency had really dropped the ball on one of the most important important targets. So as it goes to why people come to us, I think generally, for somebody like me, like the Snowden dumps, the WikiLeaks dumps, they're really anomalies. That's not how we do our jobs. We forge relationships with people. We learn who's trustworthy, and ultimately people come to us and tell us things because they think there's wrongdoing, or the American public should know about this because it's deeply disturbing or it's embarrassing. People who come to us for political reasons are really not people I like to deal with. They have motive, they have agenda, and sometimes I find them to be dishonest. So those people are typically not people I deal with.
You just talked a little bit about people with an agenda. How do you deal with either the government doing, perhaps partial declassification to try to control a narrative, or you talked about somebody coming to you with an agenda or perhaps taking a policy disagreement that they lost to the press? How do you deal with that? How do you figure that out? How do you make those determinations where somebody's trying to kind of spin you and control your narrative?
What I try to do is meet people within the government, not just in the FBI, but all over the government, and try to make sure that there are enough people where I can bounce one thing off for another. And when we run things in the paper, we just did almost a 5,000 word piece on this investigation being done by John Durham, and that took months to do, and it was extremely difficult, and we everything had to be. We don't just source one detail on one person. We try to bounce it off for 3 or 4 people to make sure it's accurate. We don't have the luxury. That's what I was saying about Snowden and these sort of dumps. We typically don't have the luxury of having documents in front of us, right? We have to go to people and rely on their memories, and so that's how we vet the information. And if people are transparent with us in these relationships that consist over a very long time, the information is it tends to be more reliable. I've had somebody in the intelligence community tell me, years ago, total garbage, and it was clear that he wanted me to publish a story, and it was then he went on to do a job later, and he was clear it was politically motivated. But I never touched it, and what you find is you end up wasting a lot of time with people who give you politically motivated garbage, and it's not worth going down that rabbit hole. And you'd rather rely on people who have a record and who have been trustworthy and who've given you good information over the years without an agenda.
Josh, your thoughts on checking official or purported to be official information from the government and sourcing and how you do that and how you approach it?
I mean, I agree with everything Adam said. I think, it's largely a process of triangulation that is, frankly, not that difficult, not that different, I should say, from the way intelligence analysts tend to operate, as I understand it, from the way historians tend to operate. You try to get as much of the public record as you can, and then you start talking to people, and you try to talk to as many people as you can. I mean, I think the difference with when you're doing this in the context of journalism is it is very important to have people that you trust at a minimum to steer you away from things that are either have an agenda, like Adam said, or are completely wrong, because people do try to feed us things that are completely wrong, sometimes intentionally, sometimes they misunderstand the situation, sometimes somebody at the very bottom rung gets alarmed about something that isn't actually what they're perceiving. And so while I can understand why some people would be suspicious about it, it is important to have a degree of relationship. That doesn't mean we stop working on something because one person in one office said this isn't right. It usually means we don't publish it the next day, and we go back and we triple check what happened, feed that back through the original sources, and then you usually sort of arrive at some version of the truth that you think is pretty reliable. That's the method that we usually try to use to get to the bottom of these kinds of stories. Now, I should say, you kind of alluded to document. If you get a document and you don't know if the document is real, I'd say the way we handle those situations is very, very carefully, because there are a bunch of stories. I don't name any particular organizations or stories, but there have been a number of episodes in the last few years where information that was published led almost directly to the original source of the information being exposed. So when you're trying to verify something like that, I think by and large now reporters stay away from delivering a copy of the document back to the agency that originated it, because that has proven to be a pretty problematic method of reporting. So you may summarize it, you may give other details. I've just gone through this in the last few months where you give them enough to let them know that you have something without actually turning the actual thing over, and that usually produces some information about whether it's real or not.
Dustin, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on what these great journalists said, this theme of triangulation. I mean, certainly that's true in any part of journalism. You want to double and triple and get as many sources as you can, but getting to the best version of the truth is harder when the government has so many secrets and will not share them with the public or the media. And so we do encounter then more people who maybe do have some concerns that they want to bring forward, or maybe do have a bias or do have an agenda, who are then going to come and speak to the press. And we always try to get it as correct as possible. But I guess all comments we've been talking about the government's challenges with trust in the public because of classification, but it makes our job much, much more difficult to get to the truth, the most perfect version of it or the most accurate version of it, when we have to rely entirely on confidential human sources who are coming forward, speaking to us and trying to leak something and potentially facing a severe penalty for that. And so I just think that's something that I don't think the government really recognizes sometimes, is that the problems that they have with the way they're being covered is in large part, or at least somewhat, to the fact that they are so resistant to disclosing secrets that in often cases, and many times, are not that sensitive. And it makes it our job with the public and maintaining trust in the media much harder, as well as the government's job to create trust with the public harder as well. And just to your point about partial declassification, and I think that is a challenge as well, when an agency might say, we're going to provide you a certain data point, but we're not going to tell you more specifics about it, and then we're just supposed to trust it. But that's not our job, to just trust what they're saying. I think back to the Snowden disclosures again, and there was this debate shortly after about the Call Detail Records program, which was the first sort of major story that emerged out of that. And there were the talking points that came out from the NSA and others was, the call detail records, the metadata that we're collecting, domestic metadata has, contributed to preventing, I don't remember the number, but it was something like 94 terrorism plots that were thwarted as a result from that. And then Congress and the media and others scrutinized that, and there was some back and forth. And then they came back and said, well, actually, maybe it's more like 30. And then there was another round of that. And then they said, well, we really looked at the numbers, and it looks like there's maybe a handful, like 6 or 7. And then a couple months later, under further scrutiny, there were 0 specific examples, 0, that they could point to and say that this program actually prevented a terrorism attack from occurring. But that was not what initially was disclosed. What initially was disclosed was a partial information of a classified program that ended up being under further scrutiny. I think some would say misleading, and that makes our job harder as well. So I think all of these things are just things that the government needs to grapple with, but they need to understand that when we're doing our jobs, there's a reason why we are so skeptical of the claims being made about different programs and just different classified issues, because often the full story is not told.
Of course, we are talking about something that is governed by a legal framework, the publishing, the receipt and the publishing of classified information. And I just wanted to explore a little bit about how, if any way, you think about that and how that applies to the press. Of course, the U.S. government has an extensive, detailed framework, as you've heard about at this conference, governing classified information. You've also heard about some of the problems and challenges of those frameworks. There are laws on the books that prohibit the receipt of national defense information.
A very good one.
And even more strict laws on publishing classified intelligence, on communications intelligence, Dustin. Maybe I'll start with you, Dustin, or Adam, or whoever wants to weigh in. Are these laws part of this conversation? We're talking about it as if we get the information, we check it, we make a balancing test. Do these laws factor into the conversations that happen when you get this information?
Well, there's really, I mean, for me, no, I don't look at information and wonder, well, is this TS, SCI, is this secret, no foreign? Like, it doesn't matter. The test is it newsworthy? Should the public know about it? And then when I go to the agency, because even though it's a bureaucratic government agency, we have to be fair and we say, okay, is there any reason not to publish this, right? And there has been at least one extraordinary example in my career where the agency made a very impressive argument and I could not publish the story. And I really wanted to. So, but it was the responsible thing to do and I ate it. So, but, we don't typically look at things and wonder, well, it's secret, should we not do it? I think one thing at least I'm very careful about is, you can't ask people, I don't ask people to go and rummage through computers to pull something for me, right? If people want to provide me something, that's fine, right? You're sort of a passive recipient, and that's really important. I think that's a really important distinction when it comes to journalism. That people want to provide information to us, and of course we receive it, but we're not asking. I'm not. I don't ask people to go in computers and pull things out and give them to me because that would be breaking the law. So,
but of course, all the sites do now make available Dropboxes and secure ways to communicate and encourage people to contact them.
Right.
So there is.
You think that's solicitation?
I'm just making the point that there is out there. I won't express a legal opinion under 18 U.S.C. 793 on solicitation, but I would say clearly, as you know, there are in many news media sites. It's a feature of the internet, right? It contact us via these encrypted means. So it is not entirely free of making yourselves available through encrypted and other means,
right,
to do that.
No, go ahead. This is, as you know, an important point in the the WikiLeaks Julian Assange prosecution, and I just wanted to mention, that's playing itself out, but it does have, I think, there's a lot of concerns within the Fourth Estate about the implications of how that might resolve itself. But yeah, I think the idea that having publicly available mechanisms for people to contact us securely is very different than sort of coercing someone into stealing classified information or hacking into classified databases, and instructing them on how to do that. I'm not in any way opining on the WikiLeaks case itself, but those are clearly very different things, and I don't think any of us will be taking down our secure drop links anytime soon.
Do you think there's a misperception out there? I mean, do you encounter that people think you are soliciting and going and doing that, or do you not encounter that?
I mean, I typically don't encounter that. I mean, I look for good stories, and if people want to talk to me about them, they can.
Noman, we are talking about this balance here, and Adam talked about, my test is newsworthiness, and the media will make a judgment on this. I wanted to get your perspective on how do you approach this in terms of balancing transparency versus the government perhaps saying that if you publish this, it's going to cause significant or grave harm to the United States. How do you approach this tension where kind of as the media, you almost have this power to resolve it, and it's on the media to resolve this? Adam talked about the government having to make the case to him about why it will cause harm, even though if something is properly classified by its nature, it's supposed to, the publication of it would cause grave harm to the United States. How do you approach that tension?
I think about the Ukraine war, which on a professional and personal level for the AP and for everybody else here on stage, we have colleagues that were in Russia, that are in Ukraine, that are cycling in and out. And the idea of you're reporting something puts someone in danger is maybe more real to me in my career now than it's ever been. And from a government perspective, I think about early in the war, there were some comments that we were getting about there was intelligence sharing that was discussed that Senator Cornyn talked about, the DNI talked about yesterday, that the U.S. has got a very active intelligence sharing program with Ukraine. There were some restrictions on targeting, and there still are, but there were restrictions that ended up being changed in the first weeks of the war. And I was one of the reporters who got some information about that. And I would have these conversations where I would get certain details or certain specifics or certain suggestions. And there were very active conversations with people at ODNI about what makes...
Office of Director of National Intelligence?
Yeah, that's right. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence, about what makes sense to publish, what's changing, how it's the same. And, there's things that they made, in my opinion, good arguments about withholding, but then there were things that I don't think they wanted anything out there about these guidelines even changing, but we did what we felt was at the intersection of disclosure to the point that I think Adam and others have made, as well as protecting people. And I think the only other thing I would say is earlier in the day we were talking about how humans and artificial intelligence programs can benefit from a broader corpus of classified information to, for example, if a program has looked through 10 million documents, the next 10 million, it gets a better sense of what's classified correctly, what's incorrectly, and it gives you better recommendations. And as someone who's relatively new to the beat still, I find it helpful to see the relatively limited amount of information that's been unclassified, so I can get a sense of what makes sense when a source is telling you something, who's spinning you, who's giving you honest information. But in the end, all of that is to say we have to make judgment calls, and those are very difficult, and you have to trust people that there's supposed to be an adversarial relationship between journalists and the government that they cover, but it just relies on human relationships and making a judgment call and hoping that at the end of the day, you do what's best.
Let me go ahead. Yeah, John.
Comment on that.
Absolutely.
So I think one thing that gets a little complicated in this area is a question of which harms we're trying to prevent and whose harms we're trying to prevent. And so when you're reporting on topics that don't have to do with life and death, that can be a lot sort of simpler to just sort of say, well, we'll just let the information out, and whatever happens, happens. One of the problems with a war is there are at least two sides in a war, right? So when you say we're going to try to reduce harm, in that context, suddenly you're in a very complicated conversation. And it's a conversation that I think, we have mention of WikiLeaks. The people that run or ran WikiLeaks have a very different perspective on the world and the appropriate role of the United States in that world than many Americans do. I think all of us work for primarily American-owned or American-based news organizations. But not every news organization in the world is American-owned, and not everyone has the same outlook. Some publications in different parts of the world have editorial views that are almost openly hostile to U.S. foreign policy. So some of the things that were done in the past, I think, by ODNI or their predecessors, CIA, and different organizations, there was assumption of a common frame of reference that if the publisher of the New York Times or the publisher of Politico gets in the same room, where actually comes to mind now, actually owned by a German company, so maybe we're not an American news organization anymore. But if you get in the same room, is everyone going to have the same basic perspective on how bad it would be if these three things happened? Maybe not.
I'll give one quick example. There was an American contractor in Pakistan who killed, how many people did he kill? Two. And he killed two people. So we all found out that he had worked, all the intelligence reporters, we found out, this is years ago, we found out he worked for the CIA, right? So he killed these people on the street, these Pakistanis, they had him in a Pakistani prison. So of course we're all wondering what was going on, and eventually we all find out he worked for the CIA. And the CIA's position was like, if you run this story, you're going to kill him. They will kill him if you run this story. And we're like, well, that's a pretty high bar, right? He's in a prison, right? And like, well, what if we didn't know what was going on in the prison, and maybe they were going to kill him, and we all stood down. And then the Guardian, right, in London said, well, we're running that story. Declan Walsh did. And then what was his name? Ray Davis, is that it?
Raymond Davis.
Raymond Davis. And he was released like 3 weeks later, 2 weeks later. So I'm not saying that was the right call, but I didn't see that coming. So
can I very quickly, Josh, you made a really good point. And that's part of, I think, the answer too, is we don't play for one team. None of us do. I mean, but the hard part is we're all based in Washington. And I think that's where having conversations with colleagues around the world and making sure that we develop a neutral and nonpartisan perspective to the extent that that's possible is critical.
Has this changed the balance in terms of the pressure to publish because the internet, the fact that you all work for organizations where you may participate in those conversations with the government, and of course, going back decades prior to the internet, there would be limited ability to publish, and certainly the ability to just dump out raw information. Now, if you don't publish something, you talked about how people may approach you, Adam, that are untrustworthy, or the ways you approach those things. Does this increase the pressure to publish when you know that there is a variety of outlets, a massive proliferation of them? It is not just these outlets, or that does not factor into it in terms of the pressure to publish?
It's dangerous to operate that way because when you rush, you make mistakes. I mean, that's in anything you do in life. It's just not journalism, right? And there are too many landmines in this reporting. And I always say there's not a gun to our head. We don't have to publish the story because there's nothing worse than publishing it and then knowing there's a mistake, or God forbid, the story itself the premise of it is wrong. So I will never be pressured into publishing a story. It's just not worth it at the end of the day. And you wonder, will you publish it? I mean, how many of these? What's the shelf life of some of these stories anyway?
What if the government tells you that it's going to cause harm? Or is there a concern that, okay, I get that, but if I hold on to it, it'll just go someplace else, so I might as well just go ahead?
I know the government. I know one particular instance, the government. I wrote a story at the Washington Post about how the CIA and the Mossad had killed this infamous Hezbollah guy named Mugnia, Damascus, and they used a car bomb to do it. And I thought it was newsworthy to tell the American public that we had used a car bomb to kill somebody, because that's not typically how we kill people. I mean, you could argue there's not a difference between a drone and a car bomb, but whatever. So we decided to publish, and then Newsweek had been sitting on the story for 18 months. I didn't realize that. And then I heard they were scrambling to get their story up. So, but our story was done. We just, we published and beat them, but that we weren't. I don't think we weren't racing against them. So.
Yeah, I think of another example that comes to mind is during the Trump administration, the Ukraine whistleblower complaint that led to the first impeachment, before it was cool impeachment. And well, people forget there were two in rapid succession. There was a lot of interest politically at the time, and in large parts of the public in the identity of the whistleblower. And there were lots of large media organizations that did not publish the name of the whistleblower due to, I haven't spoken to all these media organizations, but it seems clear that there was concerns about what publishing the name of or the identity, the presumed identity of that person would do. But the identity was out there on the internet. Like, you could find it. If you looked hard enough, there were other outlets. There were lawmakers even at times who had sort of referenced it. And that was not a decision that seemed to be made because, it's information's out there, therefore we're going to just do what we think is like ethically irresponsible otherwise, and just like join the fray. I think the organizations involved, the newspapers and so forth would sit down and have the conversation about, what is the benefit here of doing this? What is the public interest in it, and what is the harm? And I think you can disagree on the merits of any specific case, but that was not something that that people that in our newsroom or in other newsrooms was being dictated by what information was already available on Twitter or on certain blogs or that kind of thing.
Let me shift gears for a minute and get away from unauthorized disclosures, which makes me sweat to even say those words, but and talk a little bit about the more formal process of mandatory declassification review, FOIA, the use of presidential libraries. I think, Josh, you on this panel have probably made extensive use of presidential libraries as part of your work, especially, I think, the Clinton Library, having written on this. Could you talk about your experience in using the libraries and the media mandatory declassification reviews in FOIA?
Sure. Well, I think you said yesterday or earlier that FOIA is a very powerful tool. And it might be like the way a blunt club is powerful or something like that. It's certainly not. It doesn't seem like the tool I'd want to use if I was having a very difficult surgery, because it's not working in that way. So I've used the libraries, the Clinton Library, the George W. Bush Library, or at least their papers, a couple different ways. One is we have these, for better or for worse, political dynasties at the moment, right? So you have the Clinton dynasty, the Bush dynasty, I don't know if you'd call Trump's a dynasty, but he may have departed and is now trying to come back on the political scene. So that provides for reporters all kinds of opportunities to revisit things that were historical and were considered, I think, in the history box, but suddenly are newsworthy again. So that's the context in which some of this reporting I've done is going back to records, for example, from the Clinton Library when Hillary Clinton was running for president, looking again at some of her activities there. And, it's very much a mixed bag would be my overall verdict on the situation. There are good nuggets sitting there to be had when these matters become newsworthy, but I would describe the overall process, in my view, as highly dysfunctional. And it's somewhat, it's not because of the people that work there, and I'm sure some of the people here in the room do this kind of work. It's mostly because the system is not operating on timelines that are really congruent with journalism. It's not that helpful to any of us to put in a request and get an answer. Adam has a good example of this several years later. It just doesn't help that much. And the backlogs are so significant. And as some people mentioned earlier, one obstacle to getting records is you have people in these FOIA queues who have gone to court, who have court-ordered deadlines, sometimes to produce hundreds of thousands of pages of documents. And that means that almost everybody else who's waiting has to basically go to the back of the line. The other way I've used the documents, and we'll go over to Adam, is every time we have judicial appointments or Supreme Court appointments now, oftentimes those officials have worked as in previous White Houses. And so every time that happens, there's a huge rush to the presidential libraries. It's now become somewhat of a digital rush to the presidential libraries to get all the records those people have, have produced, emails, so forth. Brett Kavanaugh, for example, Elena Kagan had both worked in White Houses before. And so this becomes sort of a field day for journalists to try to go through those records. And I have to say, in those situations, it's not only reporters that are asking for those files, but it's actually the Senate Judiciary Committee itself now tends to insist on having a fairly detailed record of those people's prior activities.
Adam?
I was going to give you a little taste of some FOIA madness 50 years later. And this is from the NSA, and this is dated January 21st, 2021. Dear Adam Goldman, this responds to your Freedom of Information Act request of February 22, 2016, which was, and it's even older than this, which was received by this office, on February 2016 for, quote, all serialized intelligence reports. That's NSA speak for intercepted communications. From June 1st, 1972 to October 1st, 1972, referencing the 1972 Munich Olympics in Munich, Germany. Your request has been processed under provisions of FOIA. 9 documents have been found, but they are either secret and top secret. The documents are classified because their disclosure could reasonably be expected to cause exceptionally grave and serious damage to the national security of this country. I'm a little skeptical. It's 50 years later. And the reason I did this FOIA is because somebody tipped me off to something who had worked at the NSA years and years ago. He's like, you should get these intercepts. I think you would find them interesting. And I've been battling to try to get this. And there's a mandatory 50-year declassification, right? And somehow this doesn't fall under it.
This came up earlier in the conference today about the length of time and whether how important that is for declassification. And 25 years might be a barometer, and then it can get extended. But clearly there are tons of examples where decades later we're still not seeing details about extremely important historical events come to light that we know the public has a huge interest in. And others have mentioned this as well. But this fuels public distrust in the government, and it fuels conspiracy theories, which is a serious problem that we're grappling with in the United States and around the world right now. And the Public Interest Declassification Board, which spoke yesterday, recently did release, about 20 years after the fact, the conversation that the 9/11 Commission had with former President Bush and Vice President Cheney in the Oval Office. And it took 20 years about 9/11 and about their response to 9/11. Extraordinary public interest in that. And for years, the perception or the assumption was there was something incendiary that maybe would have been mentioned in that interview that just hasn't come out yet. And that's why it has to be secret. And then thanks to the work of the board, that did emerge late last year. And there were interesting details in it for historians, for journalists, for politicians. But there was nothing seismic. It wasn't some grave national security information that was going to change our relationship with another country or reveal that 9/11 was an inside job or anything like that. But that's what people think. And so when you have 50 years go by and you can't receive these documents, that breeds distrust, and it again makes our jobs harder. And I think the theme of this overall panel is, we are the last escape valve or the last exit hatch for people in government when they decide that they want to leak things, because it means
inform the public, not leak.
Inform the public, right? Of course, but it means that the classification process hasn't worked. It means that the internal checks haven't worked. It means perhaps the inspector general process hasn't worked. It means the FOIA process certainly has not worked, and so. When you think about motivations and agendas, certainly people who come forward with classified information may have that, but I have not had my records subpoenaed by the Justice Department. At least I don't think so. I'm not aware of it, and I haven't, prompted a year-long Supreme Court investigation for stuff. But in my experience, the motivation is very much because people think the system is broken. And that this is the only option they have. This is the only recourse that they have left to them. And I think that's just really important to remember.
I want to make one point. The public reads our stories, and if we're writing about the FBI or CIA or whatever, there are a lot of assumptions about where that information comes from. And I think some people erroneously think that the FBI is leaking it or the DOJ is leaking it. And in many, many instances, there's a wide circle of people who know it, and some people might not know it in the outside of the government. And so I would just encourage people not to jump to conclusions when you read a story and automatically assume that the government, including the government, because they can't seem to get that through their head, that just because we have information, it didn't always come from the government itself.
Senator Cornyn, I think, mentioned the 4 million security clearances and 50 million documents.
Yeah. At one point there were 5. I think at one point there were 5 million. I think 5 million people had security clearances in the country. What do you think is going to happen? It's silly on the face of it. And I think it was actually General Hayden who, for the director of the CIA, who begun trying to reduce the number of contractors for working for the government who had, in fact, security clearances.
We are going to start taking some questions, so please think about your questions. Josh, I wanted to return. There's been a lot of discussion at the conference around technology changes, funding needs, just from your kind of on-the-ground view of using the presidential libraries. Just any thoughts on any of the changes or suggestions to reduce that backlog? And of course, as you heard on the panel earlier today on the presidential libraries, if everyone is running to have to deal with the latest nomination records for somebody looking in the White House, again, that's pulling very limited resources from declassification reviews. We heard that there's virtually, a very thin staff at the library. So if they're chasing around the current event of the moment, of course, that means that declassification backlog continues. So any thoughts on those changes?
As I understand it, that is how NARA handles these things. Like when there is a presidential, a Supreme Court nomination, they pull people, and I've heard that they do pull people from different libraries across the country. They, in some situations, they may need people with clearances, depending on the situation, and they certainly need people that are cleared that know the process. So I don't have a lot of specific suggestions, but as I indicated at a panel earlier, I do think this issue with the volume of information has to be addressed through technological means. I guess the one suggestion I would offer is I don't think it makes total sense to just deal with the classification and declassification issue in one silo and all the other FOIA issues in a completely different silo, because the backlogs are kind of similar, the systems are kind of integrated, and you need the same kind of technology that you would use for declassification to deal with all the other stuff that is protected under FOIA exemptions. So it would be, I think, quite stupid to have a system where only the big intelligence agencies are running some kind of massive AI program to handle declassification and just leave FOIA processing to starve to death on the other side.
Interesting,
of the program.
because the board's mandate, of course, is with declassification. So it's an interesting point in terms of not treating it just as a silo. Because as a board, we tend to look at we're really about our mandate is on the declassification. So that is an interesting point to not be siloed as the government often does with declassification and FOIA's out there, and whether or not these two need to be treated together.
And when you go through, I've had the experience of going through folders and you open them, and sometimes there's something there that shouldn't be there. In my case, at libraries, and it wasn't something that was evidently classified, but people that work in this area know things like Social Security numbers. We treat them differently today than they were tweeted 20 years ago or 30 or 40 years ago. People's credit card numbers, they didn't really try to keep them secret 30 years ago. You open a folder and there was actually a friend of mine's credit card receipt with all his numbers written right there. And so I walked up and told the archivist, you might want to pull this out of the public file. I doubt she had the same credit card or he had the same credit card that they were using 30 years ago, but still.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.